Finally, fall feeling Saturday. It's a little bit dreary outside, and they picked the best time to mow, per usual. But glad to see you all here today for our fall muster of the Colonel George Waller chapter, Sons of the American Revolution. See a few new faces, which is always great. So, a little trivia before we get started. Does anybody recognize the flag right here? That is the flag that was raised over Guilford Courthouse after the battle in March of 1781. That's why it looks a little bit abnormal, but you can still see the same color pattern there. All right, we'll start with an invocation, so please stand if you're able, and our chaplain, Gary Hollinsworth, will lead us in an invocation.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for the opportunity to be here today. We thank you for all that you've created for us. We ask you, Lord, that you would help us to continue our deep, abiding faith in you and in our country and our liberties. We are fortunate to live in a society that finds freedom precious. For those patriots that have come before us and dedicated their lives, we thank you for the soldiers that still protect our freedoms today. We thank you for them, dear Lord. Bless them. We ask that now that you be with us as we go through this meeting, give us strength, wisdom, and understanding so that we can do the right things. Bless us and forgive us of our sins, for we ask in your Son's name. Amen.
Please remain standing as our newly elected Vice President, Judd Ryan, leads us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'd like Vice President Andy Doss to lead us in the SAR pledge.
We descendants of the heroes of the American Revolution, who by their sacrifices established the United States of America, reaffirm our faith in the principles of liberty in our constitutional republic, and solemnly pledge ourselves to defend them against every foe.
Thank you. You may be seated. So our last meeting was on June 18th. We had a fantastic speaker in Bill Durant. If you were here, you know how great he is at public speaking, and if you read his books, he's a great author as well. Bill is the president of the Pittsylvania County Historical Society, and he's just a fantastic human being all around. A little bit about Bill. Bill recently took a vacation to England, and 2 days after his arrival was when the Queen died. So he got to witness all that went on with that too. But it was a fantastic meeting last time. If you want to see it, and you missed out on it, it is on our chapter's YouTube channel. Yeah, so you can feel free to watch that. And if you're interested in purchasing one of his books, let me know, and I'll get you hooked up with that. And he'll probably even sign it for you. And this upcoming Tuesday, the 27th, Bill will be at the Bassett Historical Center at, is it 10 a.m.? 10. At 10 a.m. talking about the book over here to the far right, Jim Wren, which was written about the factory life in Danville with Danner Mills. He'll be there in Bassett at 10. So, and it's free and open to the public, so make that if you can. We also elected Judd to be our Southern Campaign Vice President. So there he is getting sworn in, and Judd's a great addition to the chapter, and his brother Mark, don't really work out too. But we're definitely glad to have Judd on board in our leadership team. Last month, Jeff Briggs was at Yates Tavern, which is up in Gretna, reenacting for a group from the Wilderness Road Museum, which is out in the Pulaski, Dublin area. They took a bus trip to Pittsylvania County, and they saw all the historic sites there, and they asked Jeff to come down, and there's Jeff in his attire showing off his musket. medals at Yates Tavern in Gretna. All right, the Battle of Camden commemoration. Judd, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it was a nice event. As you can see, it's out in the pine trees. And they have a monument up to where General DeKalb was wounded on the very spot he was wounded. And that was kind of special to me because our ancestor was there with the general when he was wounded. There is an account given of that. So, and they had a right good crowd, and they had the wreath-laying ceremony as you see there. That's about all I can say.
Well, I'm going to keep you on the hook because I forgot to change the picture. But can you tell us about Utah Springs?
Yeah.
I'll put it in the picture spot.
It's a bit further south of Camden. It's a little bit more of a larger event. I think they're making it into a national event now. But it was a good crowd there. It was really hot. And they have a monument there that marks the spot where the battle was at. It's literally just a few feet from a lake that was built later after the battle. But the battlefield is not completely under the lake. They still have and the organization down there has acquired some more land around that battlefield. And so they got plans to develop it more. And I think there's a tree down there that's over 200 years old that was there. They think it was there during the battle, I'm not sure.
Wow. And about how far are those from where you live?
Utah Springs is about 2 hours from where I was at. Camden is about an hour.
Which one is going to be national?
Utah Springs. Yeah, and they had it wasn't just at the battlefield, they had a separate ceremony at a very historic church that was close by. They had a speaker there and did something, and then they moved over to the battlefield and did something there. And then everybody went to a local barbecue place and ate.
That's what I'm talking about. That is my kind of event.
And
Yeah,
part
that
of
was
Utah Springs was the Francis Marion grave site. They were going to have a ceremony there because his grave is very close by to the battlefield. But it started pouring down rain, and everybody waited for a while and finally just left. But I hung around after the rain and took a few pictures.
This came out pretty good.
They keep that
This
place
is
up
small
pretty
right
good.
there.
The state of South Carolina keeps that up pretty good. It's well marked and well maintained.
Yeah, I can tell by the bottom picture it's a little wet. All right, semi-annual meeting. Eric, anything to report from that?
That was last weekend in Williamsburg, and I've told some of you all about it already. It's our state meetings are kind of unique ducks. We did do some fun stuff. The SAR has funded the equipment for a new film presentation at the Yorktown Visitor Center, and we assisted the Children of the Revolution in doing that. So there was a plaque dedication and a nice ceremony at Yorktown, and we toured the battlefield, went over, and the Fife and Drum Corps gave us a concert at the Victory Monument there in Yorktown. The banquet was that evening, and the Nansemond Indian tribe ceremonial dance team performed tribal dances at the end of the banquet. All of that is great. I mean, that's why we get into this organization. And I'll make a plug for the annual meeting here in a minute. We're going to try it, because that's going to be at Berry Hill over in South Boston in February, and it will coincide with the crossing of the dam. So we're making a real push to kind of tone down the sticking medals on each other part and do a lot more in terms of ceremonies associated with the crossing of the dam. If you don't want to come to the whole thing at Berry Hill, I do encourage you to come on Saturday, because that'll be where all the ceremonial stuff is. There will be a banquet that evening, and there will actually be, just for the SAR, although we're thinking about inviting first responders, and maybe even the local population. We will have our own private professional fireworks there at Berry Hill, so it'll be a pretty big weekend. That's February 10th and 11th or so. Hope you will think about coming to that.
One thing I love about our chapter, specifically, I can't say this about others because I don't really know them as well, but the folks in our chapter do things because they love the history, not because they want the medals. And I greatly appreciate that. All right, treasurer's report. Gary, anything to?
Let me just give you an update. We have a balance of $6,731 approximately in our coffers. Not much has gone on since our last report. However, be looking forward to your membership due letters coming out towards the end of September, 1st of October. That's a yearly burden we have to bear.
And before we get into our program, we have a little special thing we'd like to do. Jay, if you could come up here, please. Today we have the honor of inducting Jay into our chapter as a new member. So, Jay, if you'll come over here for a second. It's a very great honor to have Jay. He's very excited about what we're doing, and I've talked to Jay some, and he's a definite supporter of local history and our chapter here. So, compatriot Dickens, do you, as a descendant of one of the patriots and heroes of the American Revolution, reaffirm your ancestors' faith in the principles of liberty and our constitutional republic? I do. And will you pledge to support the National Society, Sons of the American Revolution? I will. I now take great pleasure in presenting you with your membership packet. So, sir, and we'll get a photo up here for Brandon. And you hold on right here. Compatriot Doss sponsored you into our society, and I'd like to ask that he come forward and place the SAR rosette in the lapel of your coat during the envelope.
Talk about it on factoids.
This rosette is the official recognition emblem of the Sons of the American Revolution. Its blue and buff colors represent the colors in the uniform worn by General George Washington. So we ask you to please wear it proudly. We welcome him into the chapter and look forward to his contributions here in the future. So without further ado, I will turn things over to compatriot and State Chancellor Eric Monday as he gives us our presentation. If you never heard Eric speak, you were in for a treat. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so this is about the real big year in Virginia at the beginning of the Revolution. We always tend to think about 1776 because of the Declaration of Independence, but it was really 1775 was when the Revolution truly got underway. That's historically considered to be the start of the Revolution. And by the time the Declaration came around, July 4th, Virginia had long since been independent. It was 1775 that was a really huge year here in the Commonwealth and really all along the eastern seaboard. Royal authority collapsed up and down the eastern seaboard, but it started to collapse very early in 1775 here in Virginia. And at the beginning of that year, we were still very much loyal subjects of the crown. I mean, we were pretty sick of Parliament and the King's ministers by that time, but we still considered ourselves loyal British subjects, and a lot of the resolutions and the resolves that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, they're still, in their opening paragraph, they still affirm our loyalty to His Majesty the King, and that we would continue to lay down our lives in His service. Now, we're not too fond of His ministers and the Parliament, but we're still very much loyal to the King, George III, who, and that's the portrait that hangs in the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg. He looks like he's very old there, but we think of King George as maybe an old guy. At the time of the Revolution, he was not. He hadn't been king for too terribly long. He did wear those powdered wigs, which makes everybody look older. They're all much older than they were, but the king was just, a young man in his 30s that was still trying to find his feet. And he was very much interested in reasserting royal authority as opposed to Parliament. The man on the other side, that's the last royal governor of Virginia. That is John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore. He had become governor in 1771, and he had a tough act to follow. He'd been governor in New York for about a year when Norborne Berkeley, Baron of Botetourt, died. And the Baron of Botetourt was, he only was governor for just shy of 3 years, but he was enormously popular here in Virginia. And keep in mind, 1771, you've still got a lot of the pre-revolutionary stuff going on. We'd already had the arguments over the Stamp Act. The taxation without representation issue was absolutely on fire through those years. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction throughout the colonies and in Virginia with the way that Parliament was kind of high-handedly ruling the colonies without reference to the House of Burgesses, the other elected legislatures in the colonies, imposing all this taxation on us to help pay for defending us in the French and Indian War, but not giving us any voice in Parliament in London. And so there was an enormous amount of resentment. But the Baron de Botetourt was a very diplomatic man, he was a very social man, and he was able to kind of keep a lid on that. Entertained a lot at the governor's palace, and was very much loved by the colonists, so much that when he died in office in 1771, the colony of Virginia commissioned a marble statue of him that was placed in the hyphen portico of the Capitol there in Williamsburg. It's now at the College of William and Mary. So Baron de Botetourt died in office. John Murray was appointed by the king to be the royal governor of Virginia, and that was the capstone to his career, because Virginia was the plum if you were going to get a royal governorship here in the colonies. And New York was okay, but they were really a bunch of money-grubbing shopkeepers. Virginia was the tip-top, the richest colony, had the nicest governor's palace, although Governor Tryon down in Newbern tried to give our palace a run for the money. So if you were going to get a royal appointment, Virginia was the one that you wanted to have. And John Murray kind of had a lot to prove. When I was preparing for this, I didn't know a whole lot about John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore. By the way, the title still exists. It is now held by the 12th Earl of Dunmore, who is a direct descendant of John there. They still have their family castle up in Scotland, and it's still in the Murray family. It hasn't passed any collateral lines through marriage. It's come directly down through the line ever since, which is pretty extraordinary. But the really interesting thing about the Earl of Dunmore, we think of him as this tyrannical servant of a tyrannical king. John Murray was a traitor. He and his father had both fought for the Stuarts in the 45. If you recall your history there, when the last Stuart monarch died out, Queen Anne, the throne passed to the Hanovers, who were from Germany. And when the Hanovers came over to take the English crown under George I, the Stuarts tried to make a comeback. Bonnie Prince Charlie, who'd been in exile, came back over to Scotland. He was funded by the French, and the French loved to fund pretty much anything that was going to create trouble for the British. And so this man's uncle at the time held the title he held the earldom of Dunmore, but his father and the uncle remained loyal to the Hanovers. His father and John went with the Stuarts, and John, at the age of 15, was appointed a page of honor to to Bonnie Prince Charlie, which meant he would have, had a very prominent position had the Stuarts won, but they didn't. They were utterly crushed at the Battle of Culloden. John's father was placed in the Tower of London. I mean, yes, they were still placing people in the Tower of London in the middle of the 18th century, and he stayed there for years. And John escaped being imprisoned himself through the intervention of his uncle, who had remained loyal to the crown. When the uncle and his father both died, his father was the third Earl, he became the fourth Earl, and he had a lot to prove. So he entered the British Army, proved his loyalty time and again to the Hanovers, and rose up through the ranks and was ultimately named the governor of New York and then the governor of Virginia. So, there's that psychological aspect to history. This is a guy who had a lot to prove. He had a very successful career in the service of the Hanoverian kings, but he was never going to get rid of that taint of having been a traitor in 1745. And so, particularly when you think of the really horrible way he handled Virginia after he became governor, I think there was an element there of having to prove that he was, more Catholic than the Pope, and, more of a royalist than maybe even George III himself, and he was going to do whatever it took to maintain royal control in Virginia. So 1771, he comes down here, moves into the governor's palace, which if you've been there, it's big, but it's not that big, and all the main floor were given over to staterooms. That was, that room you come in with all the swords and the muskets, and the state dining room, the ballroom in the back. The family lived on the second floor, which is just 4 rooms, and he had a wife and 6 kids. He moves into a fully furnished governor's palace because the governor was responsible for furnishing his own residence. Baron de Botetourt again had died in office, and so he shows up, he has to buy all the furnishings from the palace, from the estate of Lord Botetourt. Moves in and attempts to rule the colony without the assistance of the House of Burgesses. And he started to run into trouble, not so much with the House of Burgesses, but with the Shawnee. From 1771 on, there were constant problems on our frontier with the Shawnee, mostly out of what is now West Virginia, and that culminates in Lord Dunmore's war in 1774 against Chief Cornstalk. There was actually, more often than not, these wars started with us massacring some Indians, and it was no different with Lord Dunmore's war. There was a massacre of some Shawnee out there. They reacted angrily. And so the colonists then wanted to escalate that. So Lord Dunmore mobilized the colonial militia, and they ultimately won and completely destroyed Cornstalk's force at the Battle of Point Pleasant, which was October 10th, 1774. That's the Point Pleasant Monument. That's also a big event. It's sometimes considered to be the first battle in the American Revolution. That's a little misleading because it was a royalist British victory led by a royal governor, and all of the men involved, at least on the colonial side, were royal troops. But by that time, the colonists had started to, and in fact, a lot of colonists out here on the frontier accused Lord Dunmore of ginning up that war so that the colonial militia would fight, and a lot of the guys who were good fighters and who owned weapons and who were potentially future rebels would die fighting the Indians and would in fact strengthen Lord Dunmore's hand. So even though it was almost a schizophrenic reaction by the colonists, Lord Dunmore became very popular temporarily because he won the war. But at the same time, they were very suspicious of him because they were like, what are your real motivations for ginning up this war? Because we think a lot of it had to do with you just trying to send us out there and get us killed. And then there was the matter of having to pay for the war, because the Crown back in London and Parliament were like, did that when you fought the French and the Indians. That's where all of this taxation stuff that we've been arguing about over the last decade came from. We're not particularly interested in paying for your little adventures with the Shawnee on a frontier that we know nothing about, and so Dunmore had to turn to the House of Burgesses to try and raise funds to pay off the cost of the war. So when he recalled the Burgesses, they were not particularly interested in talking about paying bills. They were far more interested in talking about the Intolerable Acts, the Gaspé affair up in Rhode Island, if you remember that revenue ship that was captured by Rhode Island patriots, the Boston Massacre. There had been a lot that had gone on in the meantime that the Burgesses were a lot more interested in discussing, and John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, was not. So we get to 1775. The House of Burgesses had been prorogued, dissolved, and they're meeting down the street in the Raleigh Tavern, talking about anything but paying for Lord Dunmore's war. Up in New England, you're not quite there yet, but by April you would have Lexington and Concord. In January of 1775, the new year starts off with something that a lot of you may have heard of locally, and we've got a chapter named after it, the Fincastle Resolutions, which were recognized as the first time that a group of colonists said, if the Parliament and the King's ministers continue to eat away at our liberties and not recognize our rights, we believe that we have a right to go to war against the King's ministers and against the tyrannies of Parliament. We do believe that that is our right. And Fincastle was really the first time in a document that assertion has really been made. There have been other resolves and resolutions where, we reserve the right to argue and to resist, but this was the first time that said we will lay down our lives in the cause of our individual liberty. There was a little bit of a precursor to that because there had been resolutions, and I don't think these documents still exist, but it was actually our part of Virginia, and Fincastle's not that far away from here. But there had already been resolutions expressing the willingness to fight against royal and parliamentary authority in Augusta County, Botetourt County, and Pennsylvania County. And remember, at the time, there was no Henry County. We were part of Pennsylvania County, so it was our ancestors locally that had also been a part of finally crossing that bridge over to the point where we're willing to go to war with you people if you don't lay off. So that's how 1775 kicks off out here on the frontier. You've got a bunch of redneck frontiersmen that tell the royal governor, we're ready to go to war with you if you don't back off. Then, I'll come back to this in a minute, then March comes, and you've got the true pain in Lord Dunmore's rear, Patrick Henry. March 23rd, 1775, the Burgesses are no longer meeting in the Raleigh Tavern. I guess the drinks bill got too high. And with what they were talking about, they didn't really want to be in Williamsburg either, so they go up the road to Richmond and meet at St. John's Church. And what they are going to talk about is calling out the militia to protect colonial liberties against the incursions of the King's ministers and tyrannical Parliament. And so Henry gives that great speech, give me liberty or give me death. And he says in that speech, the next gale that comes from the north will bring to our ears the sound of the resounding clash of arms. And of course that happens just the next month at Lexington and Concord. But that happens in March. And Henry makes his big speech in favor of what the speech was really about was, are we going to take over control of the colonial militia and call them to arms to oppose royal authority? And the motion passed, and that really was kind of the beginning of what's become the Virginia National Guard and the armed forces here in Virginia. It dates back to March 23rd, 1775. And then by April, you have the war really breaking out up in the north at Lexington and Concord. The day after Lexington and Concord, and remember nobody had any phones or CNN, so Dunmore didn't even know about what had happened outside of Boston. But the very next day, you know, he's been stewing for about a month over this radical rebel, Patrick Henry, and he's getting news from all over Virginia of the colonial militia mustering in every little country courthouse and arming themselves, and he's starting to get a little nervous. So what he does is he orders a lieutenant off a British warship to go to the magazine there in Williamsburg and remove all the gunpowder. Interestingly, about half the weapons for the colony were kept in the magazine. The other half were on display there in the governor's palace. But almost all of the gunpowder was kept in the magazine. You're certainly not going to put a bunch of gunpowder in the basement of the royal governor's residence. So the gunpowder, you know, none of those weapons would work without the gunpowder. They're all kept there at the magazine. And he says, take it all out and put it on a ship and get it out of the reach of these crazy colonists. And so that's what the British Royal Navy and Marines did under the cover of darkness, and that was not received well by the colonists there in Williamsburg, because it was a clear indication that the governor did not trust them. He had very good reason not to trust them. By the way, this is kind of a little interesting trivia note I just found. Does anyone know why the magazine is an octagon? It's because it was used to store gunpowder. It was believed that a square building, if you had an accidental gunpowder explosion, it would blow everything out. And they believed the octagon shape and the cone roof would direct the blast upwards. That's why it's also surrounded by that wall. It was not to keep people out, it was to keep an accidental explosion in. That's why that thing looks the way that it does. Two other, this is sort of the sequel to the gunpowder incident. So the colonists in Williamsburg are furious that the governor's removed the powder. There's a confrontation right there in Williamsburg, and the governor ultimately agreed to pay 350 pounds sterling to reimburse the colony for the gunpowder that they accused him of having stolen and put out onto a royal ship. The gunpowder did not get returned, but the colony was reimbursed for it. And then later on, and throughout the Revolution, gunpowder becomes a real issue for the colonists. You can't fire your muskets or your cannons without it. We didn't have any domestic production capability. By August of 1775, Henry St. George Tucker, very notable Virginia merchant, his house is still there in colonial Williamsburg, and his son was married to the governor of Bermuda. He cuts a secret deal with some smugglers in Bermuda to purchase 100 barrels of gunpowder and smuggle them onto a ship and bring it back to the colonies. Half of it went to Charleston, the other half went to Philadelphia. The whole smuggling incident became widely known on the island of Bermuda. It was never investigated and no one was ever brought to justice. Why? Because Henry St. George Tucker's son was married to the daughter of the royal governor of Bermuda, and he wasn't about to stick his nose into that. So the gunpowder incident in Virginia, the gunpowder incident in Bermuda are very closely related. It was all intended to get a supply of gunpowder back here to the colonies. But when you think about it, 100 barrels of gunpowder is not going to get you very far when you're fighting the most powerful army on earth. We spent the whole Revolution trying to create a domestic gunpowder industry. It never really happened. Ultimately, the French provided about 90% of our gunpowder throughout the war. And finally, a French immigrant by the name of DuPont, at the end of the you may have heard of DuPont, at the end of the Revolution did manage to come up with domestic gunpowder manufacturing capability. And so by the time of 1812, we were okay with a local gunpowder supply. So, back to March, the resolution passes, the militia is mobilized, and by May, the militia is marching on Williamsburg. That hadn't happened since just a century earlier when Nathaniel Bacon marched on Jamestown and the royal governor had to flee. Same thing happened in 1775. Lord Dunmore, the militia literally shows up at one end of Duke of Gloucester Street, and the governor packs up his family and leaves. Leaves the governor's palace and goes to Portobello, which is the royal hunting lodge, the governor's royal hunting lodge, which is now on the grounds of Camp Peary, down near Yorktown. If you've been in the historical triangle area, this house still exists. Camp Peary is used primarily by the CIA, so I can assure you can't see it, but it's still there. And the governor and his family, they take off to Portobello. They stay there for several weeks. At one point, he leaves his family there. He returns to Williamsburg to try and negotiate with the colonists, and I've never been able to find out exactly what happened, but something pretty unpleasant did happen when he comes back to Williamsburg, because the accounts say that the governor was wounded in the leg and again fled Williamsburg, got his family from Portobello, and they wind up on the HMS Valley, and he leaves Williamsburg forever. That was the circumstances of the departure of the last royal governor from Williamsburg. That's mid to late May when that occurs. And Dunmore essentially remains a seaborne refugee for the remainder, almost all of 1775. The royal authority at that point was essentially confined to the Royal Navy ships that were stationed in the Chesapeake. And at Dunmore's direction, they traveled all over the Chesapeake Bay, raiding plantations and small market towns in an attempt to reassert royal control, and the only effect that that had was to make people angrier and angrier at Lord Dunmore, and that also started to change royal attitudes. This wasn't Parliament, and this wasn't one of the King's ministers. This was essentially the King's viceroy, the King's man in Virginia. This was the man who lived in the governor's palace, that had the royal crest on the front, the royal lion and unicorn carved on the gateposts out front, and was the King's personal representative in Virginia. By the summer of 1775, Washington said, if the King's man Dunmore is not either deprived of life or liberty, I see no way for Virginia to essentially get through this crisis than to leave the authority of the king. So by the waning days of 1775, that was kind of the attitude of the colonists. This was no longer so much king and parliament as it was the king's man and, by extension, the king. And then by November, Dunmore, in a fit of desperation, does something that really ticks off the colonists. He issues Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which promises emancipation to any slave that will escape from their master and join the king's cause. Not Parliament's cause, the king's cause. This was not a popular proclamation in Virginia, to say the least. He promised them both freedom and arms to fight against their former masters, and that was really the last straw as far as the colonists were concerned. And the proclamation made a point of saying, His Majesty the King will offer you liberty and arms if you take up the cause of the king's cause against your former masters. So that kind of was the final crossing of the Rubicon. Right after that, in December, you have the Battle of Great Bridge. We hear more often about the Battle of Morris Creek in North Carolina. We had our own bridge battle. This is outside. This is the approach to Norfolk, and it was an attempt by Dunmore and the royal troops to, frankly, reestablish a land base where they would be able to potentially reassert royal control over the colony The Battle of Great Bridge was a complete disaster for Dunmore and his men, and they were unsuccessful in trying to reestablish royal control. And so the year closes out New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, Lord Dunmore orders his flotilla to bombard Norfolk. It was his desire to destroy the warehouses that had supplies along the waterfront. They did set those buildings ablaze with artillery fire, and then it spread throughout the rest of the city. I think revisionist historians like to claim that it was the Patriots that burned their own city of Norfolk to incite the colonists even further. Frankly, the colonists couldn't be more incited against Lord Dunmore at this point. And I think it was just a waterfront fire that got out of control and wound up burning the rest of the city. But in any event, Norfolk started off New Year's Day, 1776, in ashes. And if you think the colonists were angry before that, they were really angry after the King's men had burned the second city of the colony to the ground. So what happens after that? Well, the rest, as they say, is history. By May of 1776, the 5th Virginia Convention is meeting in what was once the royal capital there in Williamsburg. And on May 15th, just shy of 2 months before the 4th of July, they essentially declare Virginia independent. And they also direct the delegates at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to make a motion moving for national independence of all the 13 colonies. We really did lead the way to the Declaration of Independence. We did it first in May of 1776. In June, Richard Henry Lee introduces his independence motion, which is approved. So really, we essentially declared independence in June, but they formed that committee to write the Declaration of Independence, which ultimately was adopted on July 2nd, but proclaimed on July 4th. So that's the date that it comes down to us. But on May 15th was when the Grand Union flag was raised over the colonial capital in Virginia. And we really should start thinking about that as Virginia's Independence Day, ahead of the rest of the nation, because we truly did lead it. What happens after that? Well, Patrick Henry moves into the governor's palace there and serves 2 terms as governor with Lord Dunmore's furniture, which had been Lord Botetourt's furniture. And he stays there until his second gubernatorial term ends, and then he moves here, where we enjoy having him as a neighbor so much we named the county after him. And not a whole lot militarily goes on in Virginia until 1780, when a guy named Benedict Arnold, who had switched sides by that point, is sent to invade Virginia and was pretty brutal in his invasion. And then by 1781, Lord Cornwallis had been driven out of the Carolinas by General Greene and wound up in a sleepy little tobacco port on the York River called Yorktown. I think we know how that story ends. So that is what got ignited in 1775 and finally ended in 1771. But I think it's fair to say that the road to liberty started here in Virginia in 75 and it ended here in Virginia in 81. Thank you. Any questions, or you talk too long, or anything like that? Thanks.
Just to tie this back into Henry County, a lot of people from Henry County served in Dunmore's War.
Yeah.
So if you look at the old muster rolls from that era, you'll see Abram Penn and leading the regiment. And a lot of these guys were Bedford County, then Franklin County, what became Franklin County, but the part of Bedford that got split to become part of Henry, which then later became part of Franklin. So if you want to learn that, you got to learn how the counties split up, because it gets real confusing.
And this is on another tangent, talking about Benedict Arnold. I read an article recently, and Andy sent it to me, about where his grave is currently located. Arnold is buried in the basement of a church. This is the basement. which has now been converted into the church's kindergarten classroom. So, if you,
It is interesting.
Yeah.
If you, it is literally a children's class. You see that grate right there on the side of on the side of the wall right there? That is what the memorial to Benedict Arnold looks like. The kids pass by it every day, and his body is inside of that, it's like a little crypt thing in the wall, and it's marked, and they walk by it, and there's like
ABC posters and
like a
everything.
map, and stuff, just like
Yeah.
any other preschool class. It's all there. Kids walk by it every day, and Benedict Arnold is in that
Yeah.
little thing there. It's bizarre.
Yeah, if you look at the picture, you can see like the play rug and like the little kidney bean tables, the small chairs, and then there's a little granite square over on the side of the wall, and that's where he's buried. So I don't know if it's
Yeah, look that up because it's mind blowing.
A couple things before we adjourn. Our next meeting will be December the 3rd. That's the first Saturday in December. I know it's a quick turnaround, just a little bit more than 2 months, but I did that for 2 reasons. One, I don't want to get too close to Christmas because of traveling and family obligations. So the winter one will be the first Saturday in December. And the more important reason is the speaker is confirmed to be Hayden Bassett. I talked to Hayden a few weeks ago at the museum, and he will be here. And that's the date that he picked as well. So he'll come and update us about his digs or looking for Leatherwood, which is Patrick Henry's home here, and he also will update us about some digs he's done about Fort Trial. He's been looking for that as well. Or he thinks he's found it, but that's all I'm allowed to say. I'll lead us in the recessional. Until we meet again, let us remember our obligations to our forefathers who gave us our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, an independent Supreme Court, and a nation of free men. Thank you all for coming out. Hope you have a great rest of your day. One thing I want to say that, again, and I'll stop, and I promise. We are only as active as a chapter as our members are. So I encourage you, if you want to get more involved, if you want to learn more about our chapter, what we do, maybe take on a little responsibility. Not too much, I promise you, it's not very much at all. But you can be as involved or not involved as you want to be. So if you want to learn more about how to become more involved in our chapter, please come talk to me or Andy, and we will get you set up. I know that there are tons of events around that we can go to. There's tons of things inside our chapter that need doing, that are falling on a couple of people right now. So if you have any interest in becoming more involved or wanting to learn more and know more and do more, then feel free to come talk to me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your weekend. I think the sun's coming out there, so it should be a great day today. Thank you.